Hello, and welcome to today's healthitsecurity.com presentation brought to you by BitGlass, the Security Gap, Protecting Healthcare Data in Office 365. This is Elizabeth Snell, editor at Xtelligent Media and moderator of today's webcast. We will begin with a presentation by our speaker and conclude with a question and answer segment. Audience members are free to submit questions at any time during the presentation using the question tool to the left of the screen. For all technical matters or difficulties, click the Help icon at the top right-hand corner of the screen. A copy of today's presentation materials will be made available after the presentation. Today, we are pleased to welcome Anurag Kahol, CTO at BitGlass. At this time, I will hand things over to Anurag to begin today's presentation.
Thanks. So before we dive in here, just a brief overview of what we'll cover and some of the big points here. Our topic today is the security gap protecting healthcare data in Office 365. And for a lot of organizations, Office 365 is a bit of a blind spot. There's a lot of focus on electronic health records and moving a lot of these existing systems over to the cloud. And so productivity applications like Office 365, like Google Apps, like Salesforce, sort of fall by the wayside when it comes to their security. And there's a lot of protected health information that can make its way into these applications. And so it's absolutely critical that organizations find security solutions that can protect data in Office 365, particularly where they are subject to a lot of these compliance mandates. So Office 365 is the leading SaaS productivity suite in all industries, healthcare as well. And so market share has actually tripled year over year, according to our most recent survey back in late 2015. And so we're seeing this rapid increase in adoption of Office 365 over Google Apps and over all these other applications because Office 365 has a lot of the capabilities that these healthcare organizations expect to have, a lot of the capabilities that these organizations need in order to really enable a more productive and effective workforce. And so a lot of this data that's being moved into Office 365 is subject to the security concerns that you would expect, things like data leakage, access from more devices. These are all problems that Office 365 natively doesn't address as effectively as it should or as it needs to. And so Anurag will dive into sort of the specifics here of the limitations of Office 365, the limitations of legacy security infrastructure, and what new solutions can provide.
Okay. So the main model that typically enterprises have been using for security for internal applications is typically how people start thinking in terms of securing cloud applications. So the typical model for your in-house SharePoint, in-house Exchange has been to actually deploy your security stack, beginning with your firewall and then sort of layering it with DLP or IPS, IDS, those types of functions. And the first instinct is to actually say that, oh, I'm just going to move my application to Office 365 now, so my SharePoint, my email, and how about I reuse the same infrastructure that I've actually created for security of the internal applications. And there are a few challenges that basically come up once you start doing that sort of thing. For one, sort of once you start moving to cloud, there is a huge incentive to actually allow people to be able to connect from anywhere and everywhere. And that's how typically we see how a lot of IT teams kind of sell move to the cloud to their users, because then they sort of have the ability to be able to connect from their mobile devices, from their home machines, not having to VPN in, etc., are all things that people sort of look forward to. And in addition to sort of this, the usability part of it, there are a lot of other challenges around just the scalability of the internal infrastructure, where you make everybody from everywhere sort of VPN into your infrastructure, and then the DLP engines, etc., that you have deployed basically start becoming bottlenecks for access from anywhere. And the third piece of it ends up being sort of this whole blind spot around unmanaged devices, where yes, you can get people to VPN in on their sort of company-issued devices, etc. But once they're using grandma's PC and want to check their email or get access to a particular file, then, those VPN type things are not really possible. And so people want to be able to go directly to Office 365 and access those documents. And that becomes a big blind spot in sort of the traditional model of security. So sort of moving on in terms of how Office 365, so this is like a shared model of responsibility between what security Office 365 provides and what sort of is the responsibility of the user of Office 365. So when your organization goes in, so Office 365, of course, is responsible for its own security of its own infrastructure. So they will make sure that their networks are not breached, their servers are well provisioned, they have enough storage, the application itself is secure against sort of attacks from third parties going directly and trying to attack Office 365 itself. So all of that is really Microsoft's responsibility, and they do a really good job at it. But then once you start moving your data into Office 365, that sort of becomes your responsibility as an organization, because then you get to, it's sort of your compliance mandates are still present whether you are sort of moving the data to Office 365 or keeping it on-prem. And that's where things like sort of your information, your own data protection, once people start taking data out of Office 365, for example, identity and access management, all of those are sort of responsibilities that are still with the enterprise. And that's where sort of this split happens, and you sort of have to find your own solutions for those pieces. So particularly in the healthcare industry, a lot of these security requirements are really driven from compliance mandates. So you have HIPAA compliance, for example, and now you have people sort of starting to put, for example, sensitive documents into SharePoint, or some sensitive health data that gets emailed around and then it is coming down to sort of your devices, etc. And those are all sort of things that make a security system required for Office 365. So for example, when customers move to Office 365, they definitely want a lot more visibility and control of the data that is actually being moved in to Office 365. So you may have requirements which say that you can move kind of non-sensitive data to Office 365, but anything with PII, PHI cannot be moved to Office 365. Or you may have requirements that, well, I have certain SharePoint sites where I allow sort of PHI, PII type data to go in, but then those sites have to be really protected, and nothing can be externally shared from those sites and things like that, while there may be other sites from which you allow sharing of sort of non-sensitive data. So a lot of these sorts of things then sort of fall into your bucket, and that's where sort of casbs come in to add on to the security that Office 365 provides for their own infrastructure. Other big problems for healthcare companies are, or rather any company, right, is basically around account hacking, for example. So you have all your users created in Office 365, but then password gets compromised, or there's a breach of a password somewhere else, and because typically people end up using the same password everywhere. And so it could be a very unrelated site that gets hacked, but then your users' passwords get pulled up, and then people start using them for Office 365. So these are sort of things that definitely worry every company moving towards the cloud, and how to sort of find solutions for such problems. So the way sort of we see security for Office 365, we see it in these four buckets. So we sort of refer to one part of it as access control, which is sort of which users using what types of devices, what locations, etc. are allowed to, for example, connect to your Office 365 instance. You have problems with the data in the cloud, as I was mentioning before, where Do I allow certain data to go into the cloud? When I put the data into the cloud, do I need to encrypt certain data and not other data? So there is a lot of requirements around security of data that is in the cloud, so in your Office, in your SharePoint, in your OneDrive, for example. The third piece of it ends up being mobility, where, again, people are accessing this data from anywhere, not necessarily from your own network, and now they want to be able to download certain documents, or ActiveSync is a very popular thing where you just want mobile email, for example. And so all the mobile email is coming down on the devices, and suddenly somebody emails a large spreadsheet of 20,000 user records to a mailing list. And then all that same information is basically synced across 10,000 of your devices, and each one of them becomes basically a HIPAA violation risk, because every time basically anybody loses a phone, it's possible that you have basically compromised 10,000 records, and you may have to end up reporting such things. So those are the types of problems then people sort of start worrying about and coming towards security solutions and how they can be helped. And of course, all of this is sort of tied with identity, where, as I mentioned before, in terms of the whole account hacking and those sorts of things, as to how do you sort of build additional layers of security on top of your existing identity management. So you may be using ADFS, or you may be using sort of your own internal identity management solutions, but then you want sort of additional security layers on top of it, so that you can actually identify sort of risky logins, etc., and be able to take action. So I'll just sort of go a little deeper into each of those points. So around cloud and access, for example, what I mentioned was that, again, it's very easy to go put data into Office 365. So a user can go and very easily upload a file with sensitive information into your OneDrive or SharePoint, etc. And then Office 365 definitely makes the sharing of that information really easy, which is actually a really big plus point of moving towards these cloud file sharing type functions. But then the risk is obviously there, because then you are worried about people being able to sort of accidentally share things which they're not supposed to share externally, and again causing HIPAA violations or things like that in your environment. There is definitely a big push towards being able to control access from, for example, managed versus unmanaged devices. So one piece of it becomes, I want to be able to identify a managed device and say that, okay, I will only allow, for example, all these thick client applications only on my managed devices. So your Outlook, your sync clients for SharePoint and OneDrive, for example, because they actually have a way of syncing down large amounts of data. So as soon as you put a sync client on a machine, it will download the entire directory structure of whatever is basically in your OneDrive or SharePoint folder. And doing that sort of thing on, for example, an unmanaged device can be a lot of risk, because you may go on vacation somewhere and then just go in and maybe you ended up putting in your credentials for a sync client, and it just basically syncs down all the data, and then that data sits there without you having the ability to actually remove that data or anything, and you typically forget such things. So that's the reason a lot of companies want to restrict these sync clients and Outlook clients on just their managed devices, so the devices that you are issuing, and restrict sort of these unmanaged devices to just web-only access. And that's where sort of these access control type functions come in. And then on these unmanaged devices, you may also want to do, for example, DLP type functions, where when access comes from grandma's machine, then you may not want him to be able to download a spreadsheet with PII or PHI, for example. And those are the types of functions that sort of we club under access control. The second piece of it is sort of mobility, and again, as I said before, that's a big driver for people to move to cloud, is being able to access their data from anywhere, being able to sort of pick any device and be able to connect to the cloud. Even on your phone, for example, that becomes a very big use case for mobile email, where everybody wants to be able to access email on their phones. But then the typical solutions for that are things like MDMs and MAMs, which end up being very heavy for BYOD type environments. So MDM, MAM kind of work fine when you have sort of managed phones and managed devices that you are handing out to people. But once they're using their own phone in order to connect to email, then to mandate an MDM becomes problematic because, for one, a lot of healthcare, like doctors, for example, are affiliated with multiple organizations, and they're not able to put more than one MDM on a phone. And the other piece of it ends up being just sort of these privacy concerns around like how much visibility and control you have over people's personal devices. So that's where sort of these data-centric solutions really come in, where you are able to say that, okay, you can get your email on an unmanaged BYOD phone, but you actually put some access controls and DLP functions in the middle of it. So you are able to sort of say that, okay, if there are spreadsheets with more than 500 records, for example, you will not allow them to be downloaded on an unmanaged device. But so for that, they'll have to go to their Outlook and look at those emails. But for small amounts of PII, you may want to allow it. So functions like that are made possible by casbs. Moving on to sort of identity. So under identity, so everybody wants to be able to sort of control the identity on-prem, because that's sort of the keys to the kingdom in some sense. That because that's the identity store that is used for connecting to multiple different applications, and Office 365 ends up being one of them. And so you basically want a casb solution which can interoperate with any of the on-prem identity solutions that you already have put in. And then on top of that, so layer in a security model for all authentications. So for example, being able to identify that, oh, somebody is logging in from a new device or a new location which you've never seen them from before, and being able to challenge them, for example, for a two-factor authentication, or require a certificate from a device in order for it to be able to connect, for example, to Outlook and things like that. So you basically kind of layer a security piece on top of your existing identity solutions, and those end up being the most flexible and most secure ways of connecting identity with Office 365. And then sort of what about native functionality available in Office 365? So for example, Office 365 does offer its own DLP functions, but most of them are actually geared towards sort of email, for example, where email is going out of your environment and then you apply DLP. So the traditional sort of outbound flows of email and being able to do DLP for those. But the big blind spot ends up being your BYOD, where people are just logging into SharePoint, for example, and downloading a file, or logging into your Outlook web access and downloading an attachment, and being able to sort of apply DLP to those sorts of functions ends up being a blind spot for Office 365, which is sort of covered by casbs. There's definitely sort of a cost factor to it, where even to get the outbound DLP, you sort of have to sort of up the licensing costs in Office 365. And the third, and probably the main reason why most people end up choosing a casb to protect Office 365 is essentially the ability to be able to handle multiple different applications. So in addition to Office 365, you may also have Salesforce. You may also have other cloud applications that you are considering, and you want the same sort of DLP and access control solutions for all of your cloud applications, and going down the path of sort of putting in a lot of effort to put in DLP for one application and then being sort of blind for everything else is also, as I said, sort of a very popular reason of why people prefer putting a casb in front of Office 365. Okay, so just sort of a primer on how sort of casb security ends up being different, and that's where sort of the BitGlass piece of it also comes in, where the way we sort of think of security in the cloud is actually a very data-centric approach. Because as we talked before, in the model of once you start moving your applications to the cloud and you allow a lot of BYOD devices to start connecting to your cloud applications, in that case, any kind of infrastructure-based security does not really work, because you don't control the application, you don't control the devices, you don't control the network on which the traffic flows. But what you do control is your identity, and what you do control is your data. And that's the reason sort of the approach here ends up being very, very data-centric. So the policies that you implement are actually saying what are the types of devices you will allow to connect. And then once they connect, what is the type of data you would allow them to upload or download into the cloud application. And that's what we sort of mean by a data-centric approach to security. And there are several pieces to it. So there is a piece of data at rest in the cloud, which you sort of, so for example, if you uploaded certain data and then people are sharing files from the cloud, then that's where some of these API-based approaches come in, where you say that I will have the casb go and scan my existing data in SharePoint or OneDrive and see the sharing permissions, for example, for all the files, and be able to take corrective action if there is something sensitive that is being shared against policy. So that's sort of the offline API-based model. But then the other piece of casb is sort of this whole inline piece, where you want to be able to control what data goes into the cloud in the first place, for example. So you may not want to allow certain types of files to be uploaded to the cloud, or the other piece of it is you may not want certain types of files to be downloaded to unmanaged devices, and those are the functions that are done via some of the proxy functionality. So in that case, a casb sits between the client and Office 365. So every request is actually first scanned by the casb for any DLP, for any authentication information, etc., and then sent to the cloud, and vice versa. So that way you are able to sort of take inline actions which are not possible through an API-based model. So you want a casb which kind of combines these pieces together, where you are able to sort of control unmanaged devices via inline real-time protection, but then also be able to scan your existing data in the cloud for any sharing violations, etc., using APIs. So like a typical use case for Office 365 that we would see is, so this kind of matrix defines some of the access control type things that you can do. So for example, from a managed device, if a device, for example, most companies when they start moving to Office 365 will typically have like the legacy Office applications like 2010 or something like that. And then over time, they sort of migrate to the more modern 2016, 2013 Office applications which support modern authentication. So, but you do want control over all of them. So if a client, for example, is connecting using a legacy Office Outlook, for example, then you want to be able to control such that only a managed device can have that application. So if an unmanaged device tries to connect, you can discard that connection, for example. Then on unmanaged devices, you basically want a completely agentless solution. So for managed devices, it's okay to put agents because you do control the devices. And so when you put an agent on a managed device, then you can control things like legacy apps and Outlook 2010, etc. But then once you move to unmanaged devices, then trying to deploy agents or proxy settings or any of that is actually very problematic because, I mean, for one, it's not a device that you control. And on top of that, there are obviously these concerns that once you put a proxy setting or something like that, it'll just stay there. So grandma will always keep getting her documents scanned while that's not something that you are actually aiming for. So you want solutions which for managed devices can do agent-based solutions, but for unmanaged devices can be completely agentless. So you should be able to pick up any phone or any machine and log into your Office 365 account, and at that point be able to sort of have the control such that you can apply DLP to downloads. You can, for example, even selectively wipe data on the client. So things like that are made possible by sort of the more complete casb solutions. And then the last piece ends up being sort of data in the cloud, where for OneDrive and SharePoint, you want to be able to sort of crawl the data that is already there. And for example, if there is a violation of some kind, that there is sensitive data in a folder that's not supposed to be there, or people are sharing files out of Office 365 which are sensitive, you should be able to take actions like quarantining the data or blocking external sharing, etc. So these are typical policies that we would see from a lot of our customers. So just to give you sort of a flavor of how customers are using and what type of customers are using these sorts of solutions, like casb solutions for Office 365. So this is an example of a Fortune 50 healthcare firm, and the reason they ended up choosing a casb was because of inadequate controls in Office 365. So being able to sort of distinguish between managed and unmanaged devices, being able to support Macs, for example, being able to control external sharing in very fine-grained ways where only if it matches certain DLP or only if it is in a certain SharePoint folder do you want to allow or deny sharing of the data. So that was sort of their challenge, and then the solution they ultimately ended up choosing was to be able to do both a combination of API-based scanning of data in the cloud and the inline real-time protection for all their unmanaged devices. So for managed devices, they allow the data to go direct and rely on the APIs to scan the data. But for unmanaged devices, it's basically an agentless solution which proxies all the unmanaged device traffic and makes sure that data is not being proliferated everywhere. Similarly, this is an example of another major hospital system, again moving to Office 365. And the big thing there, again, was very similar, where they were trying a lot of MDM solutions for protecting email, for example, on mobile devices. And the big problem for that was essentially people were rejecting the use of MDM in their environment because of privacy concerns or being affiliated with multiple organizations. And so what they wanted to do was essentially have an agentless solution where they could proxy the email traffic and be able to apply sort of DLP for any PCI, PHI information and be able to selectively wipe that data without having to deploy MDMs, etc. So that was an example of sort of mobile security. for enterprises.
Thanks, Anurag. So a little bit about BitGlass and sort of our casb solution, and then we'll wrap up here and move on to questions. And we do encourage everyone on the call here to go ahead and ask a question if you're interested in cloud access security brokers or Office 365 security. We'd be happy to address those at the end here. But a little bit about BitGlass. We offer total data protection beyond the firewall, so that means end-to-end protection in the cloud and on any device, be that a mobile device or a web browser. And so no matter how your employees are accessing that corporate data, some of that sensitive protected health information, you can use a cloud access security broker, as Anurag talked about, to secure not only Office 365, but really any application that you have deployed in your organization, any cloud application. So we were in 2015 named a Gartner Cool Vendor and have received a number of product-related awards. So we encourage you to check out Gartner's recommendations, and those are in the resources. We are trusted at over 100 enterprises, and that includes many industries from financial services to manufacturing. In healthcare, of course, a number of customers, and a lot of them have deployed BitGlass to secure their Office 365 environments. And so a few resources here. I think you have the healthcare breach report there, and of course you can check out any of these, the definitive guide to cloud access security brokers, another case study on Office 365 security, and an infographic on cloud adoption in healthcare. These are all available at bitglass.com/resources. And with that, we can move on to questions.
All right, great. Before jumping into the question and answer segment of today's webcast, let's now pause to give members of the audience an opportunity to submit questions. All right, so our first question, how are hybrid casbs different from API-only solutions?
So a hybrid casb ends up being sort of what I mentioned before in terms of the casb, which has all of these different capabilities of being able to sort of not only scan data at rest in the cloud, which is sort of the typical API-only solution, but be able to sort of take these inline actions. And the inline actions end up being really important around unmanaged devices, for example, where you want to prevent certain types of sensitive data to be downloaded to unmanaged devices. So those are functions that are only possible through inline mechanisms. And so the casbs which sort of combine both of these functions are referred to as hybrid, and the ones which do API only are API only.
Okay, great. Our next question is, where does a casb fit in if we already have an identity solution in place?
So casbs actually sort of work in conjunction with your existing identity solutions. So as I mentioned as part of my presentation, that typically what you want to do is you may have an identity solution, which is sort of your repository of the users and passwords, etc. But then what you do is you layer sort of the casb on top of it, which accomplishes two things. So one of it is that it accomplishes the fact that when users try to log in from any device, you can always sort of intercept their traffic because you are in that identity layer. And any user who tries to log into Office 365 is forced to first go to a casb and then go to your identity solution. And the second piece of it ends up being sort of the additional controls you can put on top of these authentications, because a casb, especially an inline casb, is actually looking at all transactions. So not only during authentication, and it can actually force things like two-factor authentication, etc. at any point. So what you can have is such that if suddenly you see somebody was able to authenticate and go in, but then you see very unusual activity, that they may be downloading too many files, or they may be accessing pieces of SharePoint that they normally don't access, things like that. You can actually sort of force a two-factor authentication on them or do things like that, which are only possible sort of by layering a casb on top of existing identity solutions.
Okay, great. Our next question is, we have a top-end Office 365 license. What value can a casb add for us?
Sure. So I think the main value that the casb adds is, as we said, around sort of protecting your data. So we sort of talked about Office 365 responsibilities and your responsibilities. And as an organization, sort of the data that you put into Office 365 is always going to be your responsibility. So being able to sort of say that, oh, I want to restrict certain sites, or be able to upload certain types of data, or be able to identify different types of devices which are connecting, and be able to sort of grant differentiated access to different users coming from different devices. So all of those things end up being sort of casb functions, because, as I said, sort of Microsoft does a really good job of protecting their infrastructure, but then any data protection is still the responsibility of the enterprise.
Okay, great. Our next question from the audience is, how do you direct an unmanaged device to the casb?
This is an interesting question because, unmanaged devices really, you have your mobile devices and you have, say, your laptops. And so for a lot of employees, on a mobile device, it's really about accessing the most commonly used apps, accessing email, accessing contacts, accessing your corporate calendar. And the way that's secured is via ActiveSync. And so the BitGlass solution offers a way to protect that data as it's synced to the device via the ActiveSync proxy. And that's also what provides some of those device-centric controls, things like selectively wiping data, things like enforcing a PIN or a passcode on a device. You don't necessarily need a mobile device management or mobile application management solution to do a lot of these core functions. Those are easily accomplished with the ActiveSync proxy. Via the web, it's actually a reverse proxy. So on these unmanaged devices, simply by going into the Office 365 portal, as is the case with Office or the Google Apps login portal, you're automatically redirected through the proxy via a SAML redirect via SSO. And so that's how users are routed both on mobile devices and on other devices on the web through the proxy to the cloud application. And that's how data is protected at access.
Okay, great. Our next question from the audience is, does selective wipe on unmanaged devices actually remove data from the device, or is it simply preventing access to data that could be accessed from the web?
No, so BitGlass actually has a patented technique of being able to actually wipe the data from the device. It's not just blocking new emails from coming down. It can actually wipe your existing email contacts and calendars.
Okay, great. And then our final question is BitGlass's casb part of an EMM total solution, or is it different?
So BitGlass can actually work with an EMM solution also. So there are some customers of ours which will sort of use a full EMM solution for managed devices and then use BitGlass for all the data protection. So, for example, proxying of any web traffic, proxying of any email, etc. So all of that is done by BitGlass and be able to sort of prevent certain sensitive data to go up or down into the cloud. And sort of EMM does the management of the application. And then there are other cases where even in the same organization, they may use EMM for those managed devices and then use just BitGlass alone for unmanaged devices, where For a BYOD type environment, it becomes more difficult to use EMM because of all you still have to sort of push applications and have an MDM profile, etc. So that's where a lot of people will sort of use just the agentless approach of BitGlass for BYOD. So there's a combination.
Okay, great. And with that, we conclude today's presentation, and with it, a special thanks to our speakers, as well as our sponsor, BitGlass. And for the latest in healthcare IT, privacy, and security news, visit healthitsecurity.com. Thank you, and have a great day.